Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. Welcome, Delegate Steve Heretick.
Hi, Woody. It's good to be back.
From the beautiful Portsmouth area, talk to us about the district you represent and how things are going on.
Well, I represent the 79th House District, which is sort of the northern half of Portsmouth and the western edge of Norfolk. And I tell everybody, Woody, that I proudly represent everything from the Norfolk Naval Base, which is the largest naval installation in the world, all the way down through all of the ports of Virginia, across to Portsmouth, the northern half of Portsmouth, Portsmouth Naval Hospital. I have Old Dominion University. It's economically a very diverse and dynamic district. And I can tell you there's a lot going on because, as you know, there have been major expansions in our port facilities. You know, the ports of Virginia, which are almost all in the 79th House, are, you know, among the largest in the East Coast now, and we're tracking the largest ships. We get them now earlier than New York or Savannah, as a testament to the work that the General Assembly has done in the past few years to, dredge our harbors, to widen our channel links, and to work with the Navy and other stakeholders to make shipping that much more available. I think that we proudly say there's a William & Mary study just about 2 years ago that reflects that 10% of Virginia's economy comes through the ports of Virginia.
That much,
and that's
10%.
In my district. Yep, it's a huge number.
That's a real positive story. On the negative side, unfortunately, our friends in Washington can make life difficult for you. In terms of the military installations that are there, we've got one continuing resolution that's about to expire, I believe, sometime next week now. With all that uncertainty and the impact on the military in the Commonwealth, and in particular in your district, what does that do?
Well, Woody, I think it really frustrates our ability to do any long-term planning, both in the military and in the surrounding, infrastructure that we have in Norfolk and Portsmouth to support the military. I think it's a frustration to all of us because in Virginia, when we pass a budget, that's 2 years. We can plan 2 years out. But right now, courtesy of the federal government as we record this, we don't know beyond next week what there's going to be. I have friends who, with the temporary government shutdown just last week, were out of work for several days. And it took them still several days after getting back to work to kind of catch up to where, to the places they were when they left. So the problems we see with continuing resolutions in Washington are more than just temporary interruptions in government service, which is bad enough, by the way. It really does frustrate our ability to plan for long-term economic development, to keep people on the ground doing the jobs that they're trained and experienced to do. And, in regions like Hampton Roads, which is so heavily dependent on, the defense industry, it really questions, our ability to really lead for the future.
Talk to us a little bit more about the investment that's been made in the port over the last few years. I think it's up to $300 million now, not only dredging and widening, but
Sure.
I think there are a number of brand new cranes that are being brought in.
Well, as you remember, in the last session, we put $350 million into the Norfolk International Terminals to upgrade its cranes and the automation which allows them to load and offload ships in a much more timely manner. As we've seen just across the harbor in the Virginia International Gateway Terminal, one of the state-of-the-art terminals in the world, we have the ability now to take the biggest ships in the world, the post-Panamax ships. We saw one just a few months ago which has almost 15,000 container capacity, if you can imagine that. Not so long ago, the max container was about 7,500. This is twice that. And in the very near future, we're going to be see container ships with 20,000 container capacity. Now, so we're updating Norfolk to be able to continue to take those ships. We put $350 million new dollars into that, and right now we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers to try to make sure that we have the permits necessary to widen our channels, which is necessary, because quite apart from the larger commercial traffic we see with a freight coming in, we also have national defense issues with Navy ships getting out at the same time. And we're looking to deepen our channels too, because as those ships get larger, they do carry a much deeper draft, and we want to remain the deepest port in the East Coast, because we're deeper than New York, we're deeper than Baltimore, we're deeper than Savannah. They're trying to catch up to where we are now, but given the fact that we have these much larger ships coming in and want to make Norfolk the first port of call, we want to make sure that our ports are ready, willing, and able to take that freight.
And we have the inland port in Front Royal, Virginia. I
Sure.
take it that by rail, goods are taken there, and from there they're distributed primarily by trucks throughout the state, but also the nation.
Absolutely, and I think that the concept to build inland ports, which were really distribution centers, so close to the Washington metro area in Front Royal, and in certain other areas. I mean, we have the ability now, Woody, to take a piece of international commerce which is offloaded in Norfolk or Portsmouth, and it can be in Chicago in 40 hours, wow, if you can imagine that. That's placing Virginia in the forefront of international distribution on the East Coast. New York can't claim that. Savannah, Charleston cannot claim that. I think that we have positioned ourselves through a lot of very extensive planning over the years to position ourselves to really bring in that traffic and to really move it across the country in very little time.
And I understand in the near future we're going to be able to double stack those trains that are coming out of the port up to Front Royal. Absolutely,
and one of the biggest advancements that people don't recognize, what we call the Virginia Avenue development in Washington, D.C., a lot of the train capacity that takes trucks off our roads and makes freight transportation a little bit more efficient, or frankly a lot more efficient, is limited by tunnels that trains have to go through. And one of the primary limitations we had was in Washington, D.C., with the way that one of the tunnels was configured very near the national capital. Mm-hmm. And as we've expanded that tunnel, we can now take double stacks all the way up the East Coast. And it's little things like that, and similar infrastructure developments in West Virginia to enlarge tunnel capacity. It's things like that that really make commerce flow that much more easily and that much more cheaply. I mean, it really comes to the bottom line of what we pay for things, and people don't really recognize how those types of projects really produce such a large benefit.
And of course, transportation is just as important, if not more so, in your district and Absolutely. In your region as it is in Northern Virginia. Talk to us about the transportation needs.
It really is. I mean, when people look at Hampton roads, I think the first thing they see is water. We are divided in any direction, in every direction by, the James River, the Elizabeth River, Hampton Roads itself, the Chesapeake Bay. So to get from one side of Hampton Roads to the other, we're dependent upon bridges and more importantly, tunnels, which is a national security issue. And as you know, over the years, we have made, I think, significant strides in connecting Hampton Roads into one large metropolitan area. But I think as we now continue to see, our need for additional, transportation infrastructure increase, now we're running into tolls. Now we're running into economic barriers which really begin to sort of hinder our ability to cross the rivers. And as you know yourself, and I think you've heard me say it on this show before, while we certainly needed the second Midtown Tunnel as one of the key transportation projects in Hampton Roads to help that flow between Portsmouth and Norfolk, and localities west of Portsmouth and localities east of Norfolk get back and forth across the Elizabeth River, with the imposition of tolls on the Midtown and downtown tunnels. That has really created a huge economic barrier, which I think in the not terribly distant future is really going to serve to really damage Portsmouth's ability to grow and to bring in economic development. And I think we're beginning to see the same thing happening on the Norfolk side. So that's a problem that I continue to work on with my colleagues. And I will tell you that, as it goes, the tolls will only get higher. You know, I think Governor McAuliffe very charitably described this as the worst transportation deal in Virginia history, nothing less. And unfortunately, we're, you know, stuck paying for that price tag.
Give us some examples of those barriers that you are seeing crop up and the impact on local businesses.
Well, I mean, for example, the downtown Portsmouth, Old Town Portsmouth, is known throughout Hampton Roads as really a very quaint small town. As I jokingly, you know, laugh with my colleagues from Virginia Beach, you know, we didn't need to buy a downtown because we've had one for 250 years. And this is an area that traditionally has had really some of the top restaurants in Hampton Roads. We have antique shops. We have a lot of very cool mom and pop types of businesses. The Commodore Theater, for example, that, you know, people will come throughout the region to do. Catch a movie, catch dinner, go, you know, shopping for some antiques. But what we're seeing is now that tolls are beginning to add that, you know, additional $4 or $5 to that trip, you know, people are beginning to rethink whether it's really worth, you know, going over there just for this or just for that. I think I used the example with you earlier that there was a little restaurant that I used to go to every week in Norfolk. Had great soup, Vietnamese soup called pho. I love this place. And adding $5 to an $8 bowl of soup for lunch causes me to think about whether I really need to go over there for this. Now you multiply that small, you know, phenomenon by 100,000, that begins to hurt businesses. That begins to hurt commerce. And I think as, you know, as we've seen, there's been a lot of impetus in Hampton Roads to bring us together economically, to make us a little bit more unified as a region to attract larger, you know, national and international business concerns. And it's building barriers like this. And a lot of people say, well, it's just a toll. Well, remember this. For those people who work for $9, $10 an hour, that little toll is the first 40 minutes of their day just paying to get to and from work. And that's a big injury. And it's only going to increase every year for the next 52 years. You know, when the tolls first came out, I love to tell the story. My son, who was then 14, you know, we're sitting at dinner one night and he said, well, Dad, I don't understand, why is this such a big deal? And I was trying to explain to him that this deal was going to affect Hampton Roads for 56 years. And of course, when you're 14,
right,
you don't think in those terms. I finally looked at him and said, you know, I said, son, your grandchildren will be paying these tolls. And he's like, huh? And it's exactly my point.
Right, right. It must be real difficult as a public official when you have the public and the people you represent not wanting their taxes raised on the one hand, but then complaining about the tolls that result from that.
Well, you know, it is a double whammy. I mean, I remind people that back in, I think it was 2000 and 2001, there was a regional initiative to put 1 cent on the local sales tax, which at that time, had it been done, would have paid for all of the transportation infrastructure in Hampton Roads, including the second Midtown Tunnel, without any further tolling or any further tax. What do we see today? Not only do we have tolling now on the downtown and Midtown tunnels to pay for the Midtown Tunnel construction, we have a regional gas tax, which is being used now to pay for other transportation, you know, developments in Hampton Roads. And you know, my citizens, my constituents also paying the same basic tax that you and I pay. So I would tell you that I think we're getting triple whammied here, if that's a term I can use. Not only are we paying the same tax everybody else pays, we're paying a regional gas tax, we're paying tolls, and it's certainly harming us in many, many ways.
And of course, you have an obligation amongst other members here and over on the Senate side to help balance the budget every year.
Absolutely.
It's a constitutional mandate, unlike your friends in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, we don't get to print money in Richmond.
But that makes it difficult because you have to choose between transportation needs, the needs of the schools, public safety needs, healthcare needs. That's not an easy task.
You know, I can tell you that one of the things that I've learned since I've been a member of the House is how seriously and how diligently people like Chairman Chris Jones really address our budget. I mean, I think if citizens really understood the time and care that my committee, Finance in the House, Chairman Jones's committee, Appropriations in the House, the time and effort we put into making sure that we get the biggest bang for the taxpayer dollar that we can, I think people would be very proud of us. But I'll tell you, you know, what is a concern to us is every year, and we're in that process as we speak. Organizations come and they want, more resources, more money for schools, more money for public safety, more money for transportation, more money, more money, more money. And I hear a lot of very compelling stories. But the problem is, at the same time, we are not in a position where there's any will to raise taxes. So we're constantly faced with, the conundrum of doing more with less. And I can tell you, I don't know how it is in your house, but things aren't getting any cheaper out there. And if there's no money, no new money coming in to help take care of, those additional needs, we're continually being squeezed harder and harder and harder and harder. So the trick of the tail in all of this is to make sure that we don't waste a thing going forward.
You mentioned the Navy and its concern regarding the tunnels and the bridges in terms of a national security issue. Mm-hmm. What about the rising tide levels there in your district, and also this potential now for offshore drilling?
Well, I think a lot of us were very, very pleased to see Governor Northam appoint a Secretary for Resilience. Because I think, up to, the very recent past, there's been a lot of debate about whether there is sea level rise or whether this is, manufactured science. I mean, those of us, who've always seen it have accepted it for what it is. And I'm always pleased, at least with some of my colleagues on the other side who still kind of doubt this phenomenon. I always point out that the Navy is taking it very seriously. It's going to be a very large problem if it continues to trend as we expect it will. Because sea level rise is already beginning to flood areas of Norfolk and Portsmouth, in my district, in ways that we did not see even 10 years ago.
Someone mentioned there's a new ordinance in Portsmouth about when there's flooding, you have to drive a little bit slower because of the water that's raised up.
Well, what we've seen, amazingly, is sometimes the water in the streets are so high and so close to doorways and businesses and homes that a car going through has the same effect as a boat. It creates a wake. And it drives waves into businesses, into homes. So you have to kind of slow down. It's like a no-wake zone right in the middle of High Street or the middle of, in Norfolk on Hampton Boulevard, so that we don't continue to do additional damage beyond the flooding.
Now, you sit on the Finance Committee. I know one of the things the Finance Committee and the Appropriations Committee is wrestling with is the impact of these tax cuts out of Washington, D.C. and the significant amount of non-withholding revenues that have come into the Commonwealth before the end of last year.
Mm-hmm. It's been a real challenge to try to figure out at least what the impact of the very recent tax cuts in Washington are going to have on the Commonwealth. And, having it happen in Congress so close to the beginning of our session has really challenged the budget heads on the finance side and the appropriation side in terms of how do we deal with this. As you know, we passed legislation out of the Finance Committee just last week where, traditionally we will sync up, Virginia tax law with federal tax law. And usually the effective date is the end of the year. Well, we had to go back and sort of sync it up prior to the more recent federal tax increases so that, if there are unforeseen consequences in our budgeting process because of what Washington did, at least our taxpayers, Virginia taxpayers, are not stuck in the middle of that. We don't want to see penalties, interest, and whatever being assessed on Virginia taxpayers because of inconsistencies in our tax laws right now.
Number of changes here in the House of Delegates,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure like everyone else, you anticipated seeing 15 new Democratic members this session.
Woody, I don't know about your crystal ball, but I certainly can tell you mine wasn't that good. I think that we did expect to see a number of new Democratic members of the House. I think that the election in November showed us that certainly there's a lot of new energy out there in the public. I think we've seen a lot more emphasis on things like Medicaid expansion because that was a very frequent theme in recent campaigns. I think we see a lot of concern about the way we're being led in Washington, and we don't see we don't want to see that sort of thing happening here in Richmond. I can tell you, I think I was surprised as anybody that we picked up as many new seats as we did. But I can tell you what it's brought to us in the House is a new class of members who have much wider diversity than ever before. And I can tell you there's a lot of new vision. I mean, these new members are an incredibly talented, very smart group. And they're bringing a whole new perspective to the House. And I can tell you, for me being kind of a dad, my son is 20, but we have 2 new members with newborn children. Mm-hmm. And they will bring babies to the floor. Mm-hmm. And I gotta tell you, part of me thinks that, if nothing else, reminds me of what it is we're there for. That certainly does. Because, we're trying to build for future generations. And I think just seeing those small children there and seeing their parents serving legislators, giving to their community, giving to this Commonwealth, and trying to parent at the same time, I mean, if that's not encouraging, I don't know what could be.
A real change in terms of access that the public now has in terms of streaming video from committee rooms.
Every major committee now is live streamed. All of our votes are captured, even in subcommittees now. And even last year, bills would come and go in subcommittee on unrecorded votes. I think there was always a lot of concern, a lot of criticism about that. In most of the votes now, yays and nays are up on the board. You can go online literally within seconds to see how I or any of my colleagues have voted on any issue. People can live stream from their computers at home and watch, committee hearings, so they will know exactly what's being done in the names of our citizens and how we're voting. And I think it really does. I mean, it forces us to prepare a lot more closely. It forces us to be a lot more mindful of the legislation coming and going. And I think unfortunately it requires me to wear better ties. Yes. So my wife will call and say, you need to wear a different tie with that suit. But it really does. I think transparency is really helping our process.
And for the first time in a long time, I understand there's a chair of a subcommittee in House Appropriations who happens to be a Democrat.
Luke Torian from Northern Virginia, who has been a senior member of the House Appropriations Committee, but in a budget conferee for some time now, is for the first time in I can't tell you how many years, has been appointed by the Speaker Cox as the subcommittee chair on appropriations. I think it's certainly a nod to the fact that there is much more parity now between Democrats and Republicans in the House, and I hope a reflection of how much more closely we're working together.
Now, the 51-49 split in the House of Delegates went down to the wire, so to speak. As a matter of fact, a name was pulled out of a bowl in order to determine one election. We had some problems up in Stafford County and Fredericksburg in terms of people being assigned to the wrong precinct.
Yep.
Those are issues that are going to have to be addressed. We've got 2020 coming up pretty soon, and there's always interest in some kind of bipartisan effort to redistrict. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about all of those issues, if you will. Well,
as you will see, I mean, a number of us have, various amendments, and I have a constitutional amendment to create a nonpartisan redistricting commission, which will help, at least theoretically, avoid the gerrymandering, which we've heard so many complaints about over the years. As you've also seen recently in a number of federal court decisions, we're under a current order to redraw some of the districts, perhaps even sooner than 2021, which would normally be our decennial redistricting period. So, a lot of things continue to change. Going forward, I think that, most Virginians would agree with us that, we shouldn't let, politicians choose their voters. And I think, there are plenty of us who understand that, I have to campaign wherever my district is, and I have to appeal to, voters of every stripe. I think what we've seen up to now is people kind of get lazy. They don't want to have to run hard for re-elections. So you want to draw the lines where it's comfortable. And the courts are beginning to strike those down. I think there's still a number of cases that are pending in the Supreme Court, which we continue to expect to affect us here in Virginia. How our redistricting bills will be treated is yet to be seen. I think a number of things up in the House have already been defeated, unfortunately. So I think that the public will begin to hold us increasingly to account for putting, our money where our mouth is in terms of redistricting. But I, together with a number of my colleagues, mean business. I mean, I want a constitutional amendment to enshrine in the Virginia Constitution once and for all that we don't get to design our own districts. We have to put that to objective, neutral members of a commission who will tell us what our district is, who will tell us who our voters are, and allow and choosing, in essence, our districts for us rather than allowing us to choose our districts.
One of those cases you mentioned in the U.S. Supreme Court relates to a question they haven't addressed in years, and that's to what extent can politics prevail in terms of drawing districts? That's going to be an interesting decision.
If you remember the old movie Casablanca, where the police inspector walks in and says, "Oh my God, there's gambling here." Right. Well, there's politics here. Of course there is, and there has always been politics in the drawing of districts. I mean, remember the term, gerrymandering comes from Eldridge Gerry, who was one of the founding fathers of this nation. I mean, they drew districts back in the 1700s. I mean, it's been an issue for us since literally the founding of this country. I think as technology increases, we can become a little bit more scientifically accurate in terms of who's going to vote for us, who's not, and we try to carve out those people who like us. Well, by the same token, politics plays into that. I think one of the big problems we've seen from the court decisions over the years in terms of redistricting cases is it's not entirely clear what you can consider and what you can't. Because as we know from recent Supreme Court decisions, you can't properly consider, for example, racial dynamics in a district. So in response to that, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle stood up proudly and said, well, we drew these districts for political purposes, but is that permissible too? So I think we're still trying to find our ground is, what are the criteria that we can legitimately use? How can we legitimately determine how to draw these districts? And I would encourage, any judges, by the way, that happen to be watching this, I would tell you, I think we need clearer guidance because we keep trying to do it. We keep getting sort of reversed, and that's no way to govern. I think that the courts need to give us a clear set of criteria, and we need to stick to those.
Have a few remaining moments left,
Sure.
but you and the Senate Majority Leader have something in common. You both have bills dealing with lessening the penalty for small amounts of marijuana.
I thought it was the fact that we're both very good-looking lawyers, Woody. No, yes, and the one thing that Senator Norman and I do agree on is that, as is the trend in most of the United States right now, we're looking to decriminalize small amounts of marijuana for personal possession. I think as we've seen over the years, marijuana convictions have taken a toll in terms of lives and livelihoods. It is not the gateway drug that probably you and I were taught back in the day, to other harder drugs. I think it's a concept whose time has come, and frankly, when you can drive across the 14th Street Bridge into Washington and do that legally and not in Virginia, I think that's a question whose time has come.
So a good chance of success that'll get out this session, you think?
Well, I can tell you as we film this, my bill has already been killed. So no, I don't think it's going to happen this session.
Thank you for being here, Delegate Steve Heretick.
It's a pleasure, always.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.